Welcome back to another explainer. Today, we're skipping the usual preamble because we've got a massive 1400-year-old historical puzzle to unpack, the very first migration to Abyssinia in early Islamic history. Now, just a quick note before we begin, to respect the subject matter, you won't see any drawings of people in our visuals today. But trust me, the facts we're about to explore paint a vivid enough picture on their own. For centuries, the standard narrative about this event has been pretty straightforward. But when you dig into the data, a completely different story emerges. Was this really just a haphazard, desperate flight from danger? Or was it actually a brilliant, perfectly executed master plan? Well, let's dive right in and find out. I want you to basically reconsider everything you might know about this first Muslim migration. The common belief, the one we hear all the time, is that this was a frantic, panicked escape. Just a group of people who had endured way too much persecution in Mecca and finally had to run. But what if it wasn't? What if, instead of running away from something in terror, they were actually running towards a highly calculated strategic geopolitical objective? To really wrap our heads around this, we need to look at what the historical sources actually tell us. And to do that, let's start by laying out the traditional viewpoint. So, the famous early historian Ibn Ishaq basically established the baseline narrative for us. He wrote that the earliest Muslims went to Abyssinia, fearing temptation and fleeing towards Allah with their religion. And, the logic here is totally straightforward. They were surviving absolutely brutal torture and persecution at the hands of the Quraysh in Mecca. It makes complete sense that they'd need to leave before that constant crushing pressure forced them to abandon their faith. It's a classic, totally understandable narrative of pure survival. But modern scholars are looking at the exact same history and asking, was that really the only reason? Well, this totally flips the perspective. The modern scholar Syed Qutb argues that the messenger of Allah was actually, quote, searching for a stronghold outside of Mecca. Now, what's really interesting here is that he's suggesting this wasn't just about fleeing a bad situation. It was actually about deliberately building a secure base, a stronghold that could protect the beliefs of Islam and guarantee long-term freedom. It's a huge shift in thinking. But if we're going to accept this premise of a strategic deployment rather than a panicked retreat, we have to ask, where is the evidence? Well, that brings us right to our first major clue. Section 1. The demographic mystery. The missing slaves. Okay, let's break down the demographic data here, because the contrast is kind of mind-blowing. The people who bore the absolute worst of the torture, the most vulnerable Muslims, people like Bilal, Khabab, and Amr, they actually didn't migrate. Instead, the list of those who did go reads like a who's who of Meccan nobility. We're talking about heavy hitters with names like Uthman ibn Affan and al-Zubayr. These were individuals with incredibly strong tribal ties that already offered them a pretty decent layer of protection. In fact, almost every single Quraysh clan had a representative on this journey. So you have to ask yourself, why on earth would the most protected people pack up and leave, while the most horribly vulnerable people stayed behind? And to deepen the mystery even further, consider this tiny number, 14 to 15. That is the total head count for this first migration. We are literally talking about just 10 men and maybe 4 or 5 women heading out in the 5th year of prophethood. Honestly, if this was a mass exodus born out of sheer panic and desperation, you'd expect to see hundreds of people fleeing in the dead of night, right? But 14 or 15, a group this tiny and this elite, that looks a whole lot less like a frantic refugee crisis and way more like a highly covert, targeted mission. So the absolutely crucial point to take away here is that not a single slave was among these first migrants to Abyssinia. Think about it. If simple survival was the only goal, the fiercely tortured slaves would logically have been the very first ones out the door the second an opportunity presented itself. Historians have extensively detailed the horrific torture they endured, yet zero, literally none of them, are on that passenger manifest. This strongly, definitively points to the fact that this departure had a much grander, much more specific purpose than just escaping pain. Section 2. Why choose Abyssinia? A masterstroke of ancient geopolitics. There are 4 key factors here that perfectly illustrate why this specific destination was chosen over anywhere else. First up, Abyssinia had a famously just ruler, King an-Najashi, a man known for fiercely protecting his guests. Second, it was incredibly prosperous, a thriving, safe economic center where even the Quraysh themselves traveled to do business. Third, and honestly this is probably the biggest one, there was zero Quraysh political influence there. You see, Arab tribes within the peninsula relied heavily on the Quraysh for trade and the Hajj season, so they were natural allies of Mecca. But Abyssinia? They were totally independent and owed Mecca absolutely nothing. And finally, there was a personal familiarity. The Prophet's own nursemaid, Ayman, was Abyssinian, meaning he likely grew up hearing stories about its culture and its people. Put it all together, and it's the perfect political sanctuary, a place where Mecca's long arms simply could not reach them. And the actual departure, it honestly reads straight out of an ancient spy thriller. Sometime in the month of Rajab, this small, elite squad slipped out of Mecca in absolute, total secrecy. This definitely wasn't some casual afternoon stroll out of town. Once the Qurayshi elites realized what was happening and exactly who was missing from their own noble families, they were furious and immediately gave chase. But our migrants made it to the coast and successfully set sail, literally slipping away on ships just before their pursuers could catch them at the sea. They were safe. But again, we have to ask, what was the long-term plan here? Section 3. The backup base. Timing the return. If we trace the timeline of exactly when these migrants were finally summoned back, the case for this being a strategic base becomes undeniably clear. Think about how this unfolded. The Prophet migrated to Al-Madinah in year 1, right? But he didn't call the Abyssinia group to join him. Year 2 brought the intense Battle of Badra. Year 3 brought the absolutely devastating Battle of Uhud. And still, he deliberately left them over there in Abyssinia. It wasn't until after year 5, when the ultimate siege by the polytheists totally failed at the Battle of Al-Khandaq, that he finally summoned them back. Think about that. For 5 whole years, while Al-Madinah was incredibly vulnerable to being wiped out, this elite group stayed safely put across the sea. And this brilliantly illustrates the absolute core of the strategy. Abyssinia wasn't just a random place to hide out, it was the ultimate backup plan. If Al-Madinah had actually fallen during those incredibly turbulent first 5 years, which was a very real possibility, Islam would still survive. Why? Because a highly secure, precautionary base of noble, dedicated believers had been safely established in Abyssinia, completely beyond enemy reach. The Prophet only called them back when he was absolutely 100% certain that Al-Madinah was finally a secure, unshakable stronghold. It is geopolitical chess at its finest. Now, if there is literally any lingering doubt that this group knew exactly what they were doing and why they were there, we just need to look at the words of their leader, Ja'far. When speaking to a group called the Ashariyin, who actually met him over in Abyssinia, Ja'far told them point blank, "Verily, the messenger of Allah sent us here, and he ordered us to reside here." Notice his wording. He didn't say, "Hey, we ran away and just happened to end up here." No way. He specifically stated they were sent and they were ordered to reside. They were given a specific, highly honorable mission to act as an outpost for the faith. Section 4. A strategic success. Protection and expansion. So how did this massive geopolitical maneuver actually pan out? Well, it achieved absolutely everything it set out to do and then some. First off, as Salma reported, they achieved total safety to worship, living alongside the best of neighbors without suffering any harm. Second, exactly as we've seen, they served as a flawless, incredibly secure rear guard for Al-Madinah during its most vulnerable, risky years. Third, and this is a fascinating psychological point, it sparked massive infighting and reflection among the Quraysh. Remember, these migrants were noble relatives from almost every single major clan. Seeing their own family members leave forced Mecca's elites to really pause and reflect on their own harshness. In fact, it's reported that seeing a female Muslim migrating actually softened the heart of Umar ibn al-Khattab. And finally, they successfully spread the religion outside the Arabian Peninsula, which ultimately culminated in King an-Najashi himself embracing Islam. The whole shebang was a massive success. It is just incredible what you can uncover when you move past the surface narrative and really truly examine the historical data. This first migration to Abyssinia was absolutely no panicked escape. It was a brilliant masterstroke of ancient geopolitics that pretty much ensured the survival and expansion of a major world faith. And honestly, it leaves us with a really provocative thought to chew on. If a 1400-year-old story that we always assumed was just about desperation was actually a brilliant strategic master plan all along, what other historical events have we completely misunderstood by only looking at the surface? Keep asking those questions, keep digging into the data, and keep exploring. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll see you in the next one.